So we are in the 12th chapter of the Gita. Thank you. Um, 12th chapter, page 509 in my book. I'm going to warm you guys up to start. Do some calisthenics. Get you guys warmed up. You don't need to look at your books yet. Between the 5th and the 10th chapter of the Gita, Arjuna practically did not get a word in edgewise. The Gita is a conversation between Krishna and Arjuna. Krishna, as has been revealed at this point in the Gita, 2/3 of the way through, is God. And Arjuna is a devotee, is a bhakta. Arjuna is also an everyman. Sometimes in dramas and literature, a character will act as an everyman. To some extent, every protagonist that you'll encounter in movies or storylines is an everyman, in the sense that you're intended to identify with that character and go on a vicarious hero's journey with the character. So as the character moves through difficulty and overcomes difficulty, you, identifying with the character vicariously, you're living through them, you also feel some catharsis and like you've gone through some stuff. This is why if you identify with, let's say, a soccer team or a basketball team, the Clippers are about to maybe, for the first time in their 50-year history, make it to whatever. My brother's like losing his mind, like holding his breath while standing on his head, like chanting mantras, like he has to do it 5 times. Like they have a whole thing. It's all ritualized. So, when your favorite sports team wins or loses, you feel like you won or lost. But you didn't. It actually had nothing to do with you. But you identify with that team and you feel like you are a part of that team, and when they win, you won. That's the power of identifying with something, is that what happens to that feels like it happened to you. Like someone might hit your car and you say, "You hit me." And you feel offended, like they've insulted you or something like that. You take it all personally. And so, but clearly they didn't hit you. They hit your car. You're not your car. But we identify with oftentimes things, clothes, jewelry, hairstyles, and we get all bent out of shape when a thing that we own gets messed up and we feel like something's happened to us. You guys following this? So anyway, in classical literature, they've identified an everyman character. To some extent, the protagonist, the hero or heroine, is always an everyman figure because whoever's watching it is supposed to identify. But sometimes you really get a figure who's meant to almost speak on behalf of the audience and really is intended unapologetically to be who you're supposed to identify with in all circumstances. And like I said, there's a fine line because In many ways, every hero or heroine is an everyman figure. But sometimes there's a different figure in a given piece of literature that plays that role. Arjuna is the hero of the story, or Krishna's the hero, depending on which point of view you look at it from. But Arjuna is the hero, but he's also an everyman figure. And so Arjuna is asking Krishna questions, and the Gita is a conversation between two people. It takes place in a battlefield a long time ago when Arjuna had a existential moment. He had an existential moment because there was a genocidal maniac on the other guy's side. It was like a Hitler, Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot type figure over on the other side. And then Arjuna was this uniquely gifted warrior who could stop that genocidal maniac from torturing and killing so many people. So he was going to do it. He was going to fight the good fight, even though they were hopelessly outnumbered. You following? Okay. So then Arjuna went out and he was ready against these really tough odds because he was attached to doing the right thing. And then just at the outset of the actual battle, he looked across and he saw all of his friends and family had somehow or other wound up on the bad guy's side. And so he was left with what would be a classic problem of applied ethics. You have meta-ethics, which is where you try to figure out what does the word good mean? What does the word, what does the word good mean? What does the word bad mean? What are ethics? What is virtue? What is duty? Those would be called meta-ethical questions. They're the biggest questions you can ask in the field of ethics. Ethics is the philosophy of morals. What should you do? What's the right thing to do? So within that field of ethics or moral philosophy, you have meta-ethics. And so that's the biggest questions. You follow? Then you have normative ethics. Normative ethics are kind of general theories about how somebody should behave in life. And so there's different theories of normative ethics. Normative meaning what is normal, typical, appropriate behavior. So you have duty-based ethics. You do what's right, even if it's not easy or it doesn't get you what you want, you still do it because you determine what is duty and then you follow that duty irrespective of the results. I was hoping you guys would all said results in unison. Then you have results-based ethics, where you figure out what to do based on what will get you what you want. You don't worry about duty. It's malleable. It doesn't matter what duty is. You don't have to worry about figuring out what duty is. You just have to figure out what you want. You have to figure out what's the best result. And then after you figure out what the best result is, then whatever gets you that result is what you should do. You guys follow this? Duty-based ethics, don't worry about the results, do the right thing. Results-based ethics, don't worry about something crazy called duty. Figure out what you want to get, and then just whatever gets you what you want to get, that's the right thing. Did you follow that? Sometimes the results is for everybody. Sometimes it's just for you. Sometimes it's maximizing pleasure. Sometimes it's minimizing pains. There's negative and positive, collective and individual. There's all sorts of different, it's not just results-based ethics isn't just that. You have to now determine what is the best result. And you spend your time philosophizing about what would the best result be. There's other theories as well. We're not going to get into them. And then once you figure out normative ethics, you then have to do the last type of ethics, which is applied ethics. You have to actually think of a given situation and figure out what to do in that exact situation. It's not a theory of like, should I go for the results or should I go for doing my duty? It's usually in applied ethics, people come up with thought experiments. There's a guy on a train track. He's going to be killed. 5 people on a train track. You can press a button. Then it'll divert the train. But there's 1 person on the diverted track. Do you press the button and not kill 5 people, but you will kill 1? If you don't do anything, those 5 people are going to die. You weren't involved. As soon as you press the button, now 1 person that wasn't going to die will die, but 5 people who were going to die won't die. Which one do you do? What if the 1 person is a relative of yours? What if the 1 person is a criminal? There's all sorts of ways you play with stuff. But you come up with these theoretical scenarios that are designed to get you testing your normative ethical theories in a real life situation, and you start to apply them. You guys follow this? In a lot of ways, Arjuna's dilemma is the greatest ethical question you could possibly ask. Everyone's going to die. That's the genocidal maniac, unless you stop them. And to stop them, you have to fight against and kill everybody you love. You guys follow this? The Gita is that question being resolved. Krishna and Arjuna are having a conversation, and they're dealing with an ethical dilemma, an ethical problem. And it's applied because it's a real life scenario. And the stakes are very, very high. And Arjuna's an everyman because if he can navigate his way out of the catch-22 situation he found himself in, then what does that mean for the rest of the world? Huh?
If he doesn't defeat the other side, then everybody else.
You weren't, either I was driveling, which I'm known to do on occasion, or you weren't listening carefully. Arjuna, as an everyman, if he can figure out his way out of this catch-22 situation that he's in, what does that mean for the rest of us?
Allows us to find our way out of our situation.
There you go. That's why him being an everyman is important. You get it? It's an ethical problem. Arjuna's an everyman. His stakes are higher than your stakes. And therefore, if it works for him, chances are it will probably work for you too. You guys with me? Okay. So the Gita is questions and answers, and that follows a body of texts called the Upanishads, which form part of the oldest stratum of Vedic literature. And the Upanishads typically consist of gurus and disciples having conversations where one question leads to an answer, which then gives rise to further questions, and you sort of in a helix-like fashion go over the same information in deeper and deeper ways, and you go somewhere. Just like a helix is a circle that moves forward. Similarly, the questions and answers move you forward. And the Gita oftentimes is called Gitopanishad because it's like an Upanishad. And so, although it's from a different stratum of Vedic literature, it follows the same formula and schema as the earlier Upanishads. For 5 chapters, from chapter 5 through chapter 10, by the way, I began to do a recap, and I realized that I wanted to make sure that everybody had certain key information, so I went even further back. And now I'm where I was going to be a couple of minutes ago. You catch that? You following this, Em? Are you? Okay. So, Arjuna hasn't talked for about 5 chapters. Krishna spoke from chapter 5 to chapter 10 practically without interruption. And he spoke on any number of subjects, big subjects. Ideas of self, the world, God, how they interface with each other. The big, big questions of life he answered. And Krishna wrapped things all up in a bow tie at the beginning of the 10th chapter. And Arjuna said, I accept what you've said. And Arjuna had a follow-up question. And his follow-up question was, I accept that you're God, that God exists, that you're God, that the whole universe comes from you, that you're the source and sustenance of everything. A lot of times we'll say God's the source of everything. But you got to think that thing through. Like, if God's the source of everything, then God's connected to everything, right? Then could there be a place like hell that existed that God wasn't involved in, a place which was truly divorced from God? If God's the source of everything, then theoretically things could be created by the divine, but then exist independently. If God's the sustenance of everything, everything which exists is always depending on it, standing on divinity. So could a place like hell that was completely divorced from divinity really exist? Not if you understand that God's the source and the sustenance of everything. Now, if God's all good and all powerful, wouldn't all powerful God have to make a hell? No. Wouldn't all good God want to make a hell? No. Would an all-good God want to always give you a second chance? Could an all-powerful God actually always give you a second chance? So when you start to think about the nature of God, the nature of this world, it's not that you just have an idea like God's all good and all-powerful and it doesn't have any price tag attached. There are ramifications of different ideas. Like if you think that you are worthless and you have no value, if that's your worldview, maybe your parents raised you poorly and you have low self-esteem, is that going to affect the way you live in this world and what you do? Certainly. So your concept of self, it's not just some abstract philosophical thing. Your concept of self has serious real-world implications for the way you live your life. Did you guys follow that? They're not small questions. Who am I? What is God? What's this world? For instance, let's say you believe that God made this world so that you could grow closer to divinity. Then the world becomes benign. It becomes a tool. It becomes useful. It becomes valuable. Let's say you believe that God made this world so that people could run away from divinity and that the world's filled with, the devil made the world. The world's filled with temptations to take you away from divinity. Then the world becomes this dangerous place that you want to get away from. You might even want to martyr yourself to get out of here as quickly as possible. Your conception of the world, your conception of divinity, your conception of yourself has serious ramifications on the kind of life you're going to live. Anyway, Arjuna says we shouldn't think that philosophy is just this abstract thing. It might be abstract in that you can't connect the dots, but the way you think about these big topics definitely affects the way you live your life. Okay. So Arjuna says to Krishna, I accept that you are the source and sustenance of everything, that you're all good and all powerful. But I walk around this world and I feel like the world is filled with stuff and matter that has no intrinsic connection to you. And so you've abstractly told me theoretically that you're connected to everything, but I don't experience that. I walk out in this world and I find a world full of stuff that seems like it has no owner, and I end up wanting to try and own some of it and enjoy some of it. It usually gets me into trouble. So how can I, as I live and breathe and move through this world, always remember you and see how everything's connected to you? Imagine for a moment that you were incredibly lusty. Like lust, I mean like sexual lust. Like you wanted to, essentially lust is a desire to orgasm. So you were like really like severely agitated with lust. And then you saw the silhouette of what you consider to be a sexy person. You follow in this experiment? So whether you're gay or straight is irrelevant. Just the silhouette that you like. If you like big people or small people or whatever, just that silhouette. Just walk by. So you're leaping out of your skin with intense lust, and then there's a sexy person walks by and grabs your attention. You guys following this talk? I know it's super theoretical for you guys, and you've never experienced lust before, but just try to, vicariously identify with the experiment. And then all of a sudden you realize that the sexy person that was walking by wasn't a sexy person after all. It was your child. You follow? For most people who don't have some kind of incestuous thing going on, for most people, like most, I don't know what the odds are, but I'm thinking 99.9. I'm probably being a little generous. It's probably a little less than 99.9, but the vast majority of people in the world, the moment they realize that this object of sexual interest was in fact their beloved child, what would happen to their lust? Huh? It would just, it would evaporate, it would disappear, it would plummet, it would be replaced by regret or embarrassment or remorse, disgust even. Right, some humiliation, right? Whatever it is, right? Just see how powerful knowledge is of how things are connected. Something which appears to have no owner is enticing. Then when you realize that thing is connected to you in a specific way, the feeling of desire to enjoy just is gone. It's like the opposite desire you feel. Knowledge, connection is incredibly powerful if you connect with somebody, something, the desire to exploit it goes away. Exploitation really depends on objectification. You have to view something as an object instead of as a person. The more you view someone as a person, and the less you view them as an object, the more your desire to exploit them will become untenable, because you identify with them and you see them as being like you, and that empathetic feeling nullifies exploitation. When you want to exploit people, you have to think that they're non-human. There was so much philosophizing that black people were not human that was used to justify slavery, oftentimes in the Bible. But there was so much time that was spent trying to devalue black people, because if you didn't devalue them and view them as chattel, as property, and see them as subhuman, then slavery became immediately abominable. Hitler spent many years, and actually prior to Hitler, Wagner and so many pre-Hitler German philosophers hated the Jews. I mean, Shakespeare had his issues with the Jewish people. In The Merchant of Venice, it was Shylock, the Jew, who wanted a pound of flesh. The quality of mercy is not strained. That poem that was spoken in The Merchant of Venice was spoken to correct this terrible, exploitative, usurious, moneylender, profit at all cost, that was Shylock. It was a personification of it. Now a moneylender is, in slang, not so popular now, but a moneylender is called a Shylock. If you lend money, you're known as a Shylock. If you lend money at usurious rates of interest, you're known as a Shylock. And in fact, if you read, go too deep into this, but if you read Dante's Inferno, there's a special place in hell for usurers, people who lend money at a high interest rate. Because, if the money lenders, and in India actually, in old world India, money lenders were considered to be a lower caste. They were super rich, but they were viewed as being immoral, because eventually the whole village owes you money and you control everything, and everyone is in perpetual debt to you, and you give them money and they spend the rest of their lives trying to pay you back with mortgages, which means a death. Mort in mortgage means death. It's a payment that you have to make until you die. So Hitler and his predecessors spent many, many years objectifying the Jewish people, purposefully, consciously, publishing tracts, talking about them as being subhuman, criticizing abstract and cubist art as being the work of mongoloids because it disproportionately represented the human body, and saying that Jewish people, they had disproportionate limbs and they would eventually destroy human society and render us all, mongoloids. They spent years, the Nazi Party, criticizing Jewish people, putting them in ghettos, sequestering them from the rest of society, making them stamp themselves, making them wear stars to show that they weren't human. so that the German people would turn a blind eye when it came to exterminating them with Sonderhandlung, special handling is what they called it, when they genocidally wiped out the Jewish people, and 6 million people, and 6 million Jewish people, 6 million others too. We forget about the Romani people and so many people that were killed alongside the Jewish people, 12 million, 10, 12 million, half of which were Jewish. It was a lot of work. Objectifying people is the birthplace of exploitation. Humanizing people and connecting to people is the death of exploitation, and honestly the birth of real love and empathy and compassion, the finer qualities of life. So Arjuna said, I want to be able to walk around this world and see you everywhere. And Krishna spoke beautifully in the 10th chapter and said, I'm the taste of water, the light of the sun and the moon, the beginning, middle, and end of all things, the life of all that lives, the intelligence of the intelligent. Wherever you look, whatever you see, if you see something wonderful and powerful, even a powerful mountain like the Himalayas, or a powerful aquatic like a shark, anywhere you see something which perfectly represents a category of existence, that's my energy. And so you can look around the world, and when you see the best of anything, even death, which takes everything away, even time, which is this indefatigable power that affects everything. Whenever you see something powerful and wonderful and beautiful, but not just beautiful like rainbows and unicorns, even beautiful in the sense of powerful, like death, which takes things away, time, which affects everything through decay and entropy. When you see that, that's a spark of my splendor. And so Krishna outlined this way that Arjuna could look at the world differently. We have cognitive behavioral therapy. We want to affect people's behavior so that they change the way they live in this world. And then if they change the way they live in this world, they'll start to think differently about the world. But then straight behaviorism is considered to be insufficient, like a Pavlovian behaviorist, Skinner behaviorism. It's considered to be a limited method of therapy. Maybe it works with rats or dogs or something like that, but human beings we have huge brains. And so then there's cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy, to some extent you could say cognitive therapy gone on haywire would be psychoanalytic theory, where they just think about reframing things, but they never work on real, actually changing your life skills. And so these things got put together. The over dependence on cognitive therapy that was there in psychoanalysis, then the pendulum swung and it became a hardcore behaviorism of the 40s and 50s. Then it kind of swung back to the middle in the 60s, and that's what gave birth to cognitive behavioral therapy, also really known as humanist therapy, where you treat people like the human beings they are, and you reframe the way they look at the world, and you also help them with better life skills. And that's this sweet spot. That's a sweet spot. So anyway, there's this cognitive shift that Arjuna made where he started looking at the world differently. And then Arjuna took it to another level, and he said, I want to actually experience it. I don't just want the theory. I want to see you in everything and everything in you. I want to see you as the source and sustenance of everything simultaneously. And then Krishna blessed Arjuna with divine eyes, and Arjuna was able to experience the Vishwarup, the form of the universe. And he was able to see Krishna as everything that ever existed in one place at one time, and how it was all connected to divinity, and how Krishna was in every atom. And then that form transformed. That was like a million suns rising at once, is how it's described. And then it shifted, it became the form of time. And Arjuna saw Krishna devouring everything. Because that's also part of reality. You have to reconcile that. If you want to love God, you have to reconcile death and suffering and time with divinity. Otherwise, they become these scary things which you can't deal with. And you got to invent a devil to be the parent of all those things. And then try not to do the math too much and realize the devil came from God. And try not to be forced to reconcile everything. So then Arjuna saw that. And then the chapter we're in now, it follows this flow. It follows this flow that I just described to you guys. So now you guys are all caught up. And Arjuna, anyway, had to ask this question eventually. And he just witnessed Krishna as both personal and impersonal. Krishna beyond the world as the deity that was the source of the world, but then also the world as completely connected to Krishna, almost like a pantheistic vision. So because Arjuna just experienced a personal and impersonal feature simultaneously, because these questions had to get asked anyway, because Krishna had gone so hard on bhakti and talked so much about bhakti in the last chapter, and Arjuna wanted to figure out how bhakti fit together with other spiritual ideas he'd been given. For all these reasons, the 12th chapter follows on the heels of the 11th. And Arjuna asks, which are considered to be more perfect? Those who are always perfectly engaged in your devotional service, the bhaktas. It says bhaktas tvam, your bhaktas, or those who worship the impersonal Brahman, the unmanifested, who is yoga vittama, the greatest knower of yoga. Tvam bhakta, your bhaktas, or paryupasate aksharam avyaktam, those who worship the Supreme as being invisible and energetic and not actually personal. Arjuna asks this question. He's just experienced both forms. Krishna's just touted the validity of bhakti. These two ideas about the nature of divinity don't really exist in the West in any kind of systematic way. We don't even have a language in Western philosophy for personalism and impersonalism. We actually, Prabhupada coined those terms. They existed, but he used them to refer to Dvaita and Advaita Sanskrit terms. Monism and monotheism don't do it. This actually isn't something that got fleshed out. Bizarrely, it didn't get the playtime it should have gotten in Western theology and philosophy. And it's very common for someone to say, I love Jesus, I want to follow Jesus, and then, I entered the cave and became one with the Christ and entered the white light. It's very common for people to vacillate between a personal and an impersonal conception of divinity. So I spent the entire last week explaining very, very clearly the distinction between these two types of divinity, such that I'm not going to do it again today. So if you showed up this week for the first time, you suck, and just is what it is. And so I gave you as much of a recap as I could, and I tried to give you guys some training wheels, but I can't start from scratch because we're in the 12th chapter. That said, very quickly and very briefly, I'm going to explain personalism and impersonalism. I'm going to do it in less than 3 minutes. And I'm not going to repeat myself and treat you guys like the spiritual infants that you are, and like I've been treating you guys the whole time by crawling and helping you guys to walk as I go through stuff. I'm just going to spit it out because I don't have the time. So buckle up, Buttercup. Listen up. Pay attention. Here we go. There are two basic ways of identifying with the deity. One idea is that when you achieve perfection, you go back to heaven. God exists there. You also exist. God's spiritual, you're spiritual. God's eternal, you're eternal. God's the flame, you're the spark. God's the sun, you're the sunlight. You have tons of stuff in common with divinity. But the divine source is an individual, and the divine product is also an individual. You are the product. You are not the source. And because you are different from your source, not different fundamentally, you might be spiritual, God's spiritual, but there's at least an individuation. Your individuality is concrete. It's part of your soul. It's not something you get rid of and then you merge and become one. But actually there's room within that oneness for there to be a little bit of difference. And then you can love God. Because love depends on a lover and a beloved. And if there's no two, there's no love. Like if a mother never has a child, she can't love her child. Love unifies, ties things together, but it depends on a backdrop of difference. So personalism is the idea that God fundamentally is an individual, and therefore you can love and have a relationship with divinity in perpetuity. The other major theory is that whether you have many gods or one God or whatever, it makes no difference. Ultimately, all those things evaporate, and you literally become one with everything. And there's absolutely no room within the highest echelon of divinity, the highest plane of realization, for any distinction between you and this book, between you and another person, between you and God. Every single bit of variety that exists in the world has to evaporate, and you must become homogenized, and that perfection consists of becoming one with everything without any room for individuality. Therefore, compassion for another is illusion. Love for another is illusion. Devotion to another is illusion. This second idea has a major problem. How do we get from there to here? We're in a world filled with individuality. How do we get here? Sometimes they'll say it's an illusion. But the problem with that idea is that the illusion in the absolute becomes variety. Because now you have the absolute or the divine with no illusion, and you have the absolute or the divine with illusion. And that illusion now becomes a variety or a specificity or a feature or some distinct element within the absolute, and therefore you've lost your pure homogenization. Everything is no longer purely one, because it could be the one or the one in illusion. Did you guys follow this? So the second school requires to get rid of any individuation, any variety, any specificity, any thought, any feeling, any personality. The first one allows for those things to exist. And so in the first one you could say we're all Krishna, in the sense that Krishna is a total conception of divinity, which also includes the world, and everything is part of the divine, but actually nobody is Krishna fully. We're all like sparks unto a fire. And that Krishna goes beyond the mere totality of all that we are. In fact, Krishna, we are panentheistic. We are within divinity, and divinity goes beyond just the totality of what we are. There's all sorts of stuff you can do. Prabhupada articulates this at the end of the Gita. Prabhupada says, in his last purport to the Gita, you ready? Nothing is different from the Supreme, but the Supreme is always different from everything. Everything is within divinity, and divinity goes beyond just being a collection of all of us. So, those are the two basic flavors of religion, of spirituality. And obviously there's different ideas within each camp. but I wanted to flesh out the basics. And it was 5 minutes instead of 3. We're going to keep going. So Arjuna, that discussion has been around in India for thousands of years. Every halfway decent philosophical Hindu knows about these two schools of thought and is actually somewhat trained in them, and there's a language that you learn for how to talk about these things. And weirdly, Western theology has still, today, not caught up. But that's the background of Arjuna's question. And if you want to go back and listen to last week's class, I spent an entire class on just this subject. Okay. So Arjuna says, who's yoga vittama? Who's the greatest knower of yoga? Tvam bhaktaha, your bhaktas, or paryupasate achintyam avyaktam, aksharam avyaktam, the one who worships you impersonally. And Krishna says, those who fix their mind on my personal form and are always engaged in worshiping me. So it's you worship Krishna with your body and you think of Krishna with your mind, cognitively and behaviorally. They are the most perfect. They are yuktatama. They are the most yogad, to me. Interestingly, Krishna's saying, it's funny, but when you think about becoming one with God, merging into the absolute, a pure monism where everything becomes one, Krishna says, me yukta tamma. They are the most united to me. Who? The one who worships me with love, who has enough of a distinction between the soul and the deity to allow for a relationship of love. That's the most perfect realization, and that creates actually the deepest connection with the divine. There's not as thick or deep or powerful of a connection if you merely try to become one with Krishna. A deeper, more powerful connection to Krishna exists if you love Krishna. Just like if the mother and the child become one, there's no love. Tukaram, my namesake, said that. If the mother and the child become one, there's no love. 3.5 centuries ago, he was speaking in central India, and he made this argument to try to communicate to the people he was ministering to. So I was named after him, and so he made this statement. It's not mine. So, the deepest bond, the most powerful bond, the thickest bond, the most profound and intimate connection with divinity is for the devotee who loves Krishna. Just like the mother and the child have this just, almost mystical bond. And their distinction and their individuality augments and creates more intimacy instead of getting in the way of it. So similarly with God. There's the answer to the question. It's not, obviously there's more to go because Krishna doesn't stop there and drop the mic. But there's the answer to the question. So Arjuna asked this question and the question was answered. But those who fully worship the unmanifested, that which lies beyond the perception of the senses, the all-pervading, the inconceivable, the unchanging, the fixed, the immovable, the impersonal conception of the absolute truth, and they worship that by controlling the various senses and being equally disposed towards everyone, such persons engaged in the welfare of all at last achieve me. For those whose minds are attached to the unmanifested, impersonal features of the Supreme, advancement is very troublesome. To make progress in that discipline is always difficult for those who are embodied. It's like you say to somebody, don't think of a green apple. What happens? And so this idea of merely detaching without a bigger yes, without a bigger reason to live for. Sometimes I critique 12-step programs just because I'm sort of an equal opportunity hater and I'm always critiquing everything for some reason or another. But one of the things I've found limiting about AA programs is that sometimes you meet somebody. I've been sober for 32 years. And when I say sober, I really mean sober. Like, I don't even drink coffee. That's how sober I am. I don't drink Coca-Cola. That's how sober I am. What to speak of anything else. But, one thing is you find people in AA smoking cigarettes like there's no tomorrow. Which, fair enough. That oral fixation and swapping one addiction out for another might get them over the hump. So I'm not even hating on that. I can see where that might work. But they get addicted to they mainline coffee and cigarettes. And then, I never think about using drugs, ever. And I was an actual drug addict. I was addicted to cocaine, which, at least if you know something about drug addiction, has the worst come down of any drug on the planet. I was specifically addicted to crack cocaine, which crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it's just like the most wicked come down. According to everybody admits it. So I never think about using drugs, ever. Never happens. I never get so stressed out I think I want to use drugs. Never want to drink, never want to smoke pot. But I also smoked a ton of pot. Never want to use drugs. It's never tempted, never happens. It's probably been 3 decades or almost 3 decades since I've even thought about using drugs. There was a couple years there where it was, I had to fight the urge and do what people typically do. But sometimes you'll talk to somebody who's like they've been, they're 55 and they've been sober since they were 20. They've been sober like 35 years. And they're like, yeah, just one day at a time. I could relapse at any moment. Once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. I don't agree. I beg to differ. I've re-etched my brain. My mesolimbic pathway has been shifted. I've learned alternative ways to cope with life. I don't dream about it. I don't think about it. It's another lifetime. I'm not even disassociated. I can talk about it too. In as much detail as somebody wants to without ever wanting to do that thing again. I've become free. It's possible. And sometimes I find people in 12-step programs, they're working that humble angle of like just one day at a time. And I'm just like, come on, man. Like, are you ever going to graduate 3rd grade? Are you ever going to like go to high school or college or you know what I mean? Like at some point, or is it just every day is your first day? Like somehow that's like that. I don't find that very inspiring, to be honest. And then you die of being addicted to cigarettes. You're like maybe if you'd been an alcoholic, you would have lived to like 70, but you went ahead and got emphysema and passed away at 50. Like I said, I got something to say to everybody. You need to have a bigger yes. Just focusing on the negative. It's like very Christian. Just focus on the suffering of Jesus. I just saw some meme somebody sent me. They always, because I talk about all this stuff, and then comedians steal my material, and so they're always like, people send me. So somebody just sent me a meme, and they said, if Jesus came back, he'd have PTSD because all these millions of crosses everywhere, it would traumatize him and trigger him. And it would be like a totally unsafe space for Jesus. He'd just come back, and everybody's wearing these crosses everywhere. It's like they're trying to freak him out. He's like, I'm trying to move past that. You know what I mean? I was resurrected. I like emerged from the cave, came out of the tomb. And now you're like, just like it's like it's like almost like showing silver to a vampire. It's like, that every moment they're like, Jesus like, don't remind me. It was a bad day. yeah, there's this sort of macabre fascination on the negative. And obviously, at least 1% of Christians don't do that. They don't spend too much time doing that. So I'm not saying everybody does that, but you got to have a bigger yes. You got to have a reason. You have something bigger you're doing, something to live for, something to make you get up in the morning, something that you love. And so there's a place for apophatic theology, not this, not that. God is unthinkable, unknowable, undefinable, unseeable, invisible, undefinable, indescribable, unapproachable, beyond everything. There's a place for that language. In fact, the oldest texts in the world that do that, what's called apophatic theology, are the Upanishads. We literally wrote the book on that. And Western philosophy just caught up, in the last few hundred years. Not quite. I mean, that's not quite honest. Anyway, they've been doing it for a little longer than that. I'm remembering Aquinas and Maimonides and other turn of the millennium philosophers who talked about this stuff. But Krishna makes a point here that impersonal conception is very difficult to attach to. It's like a permanent negative as opposed to having a positive. Something louder and more powerful and more inspirational to attach yourself to. A reason to live. Something you have yet to do. Something that you're put on this earth to do. A purpose. We got to find that. And to be fair to the 12-step people, they do have that. They have this God of your own choosing and this higher power. And they do have that. They tried to do it all Christian when they first started. Didn't work. People were grossed out. Then they made it less Christian and more generic, and people got into it. So yeah. On one hand, it's a less perfect conception because you're actually less close to the divine. You're not yukta tama. You're not the most yogad. You're not yoga vit tama. You're not the knower of the greatest yoga. So there's a sense in which you don't see the full picture because there's not room in your conception of self and God for love, because you artificially think it's all one. On the other hand, it's also a more difficult path. It's less perfect, less complete. You know less, you're less united, and it's more difficult. You can do the math. It's like, hey, would you like to buy this car that's better than that car, and it's cheaper, and it's better in every way? Or would you like to buy the more expensive vehicle, which isn't as good? Do you follow? Who, you know what I mean? It's like, who's going to do that? Who's going to, yeah, I'd like to pay more money to get less. Categorically less. Not like less today, but maybe more tomorrow. Categorically less, an impoverished notion. You're not yoga vittama. You don't know yoga the best. Vit is where you get the word Veda from, which means knowledge. Vit, to know. Yoga vit tama. Tama means greatest, most. It's the superlative in Sanskrit. The one who knows yoga the most. And yukta tama. Yukta is the past participle of yoga. It means yogad. The most yoga to me. Me yukta tama. The most yoga to me. The most knowledgeable. So the impersonalist doesn't know the full picture. They don't see the deepest picture where there's room within the oneness for love, for individuation, for relationship. There's room to fall in love with God, which is really what makes you sober. That's what really empowers you to let go of sensualness and compromise is when you have a big burning relationship. Somebody you love deeply brings out the best in you. When somebody just loves themselves, we consider them to be a narcissist when they're incapable of loving another. Sometimes self-love is a requirement to love another person. Sure, why not? We can go Oprah with that one and come up with some cool one-liners. But someone who merely loves themselves and doesn't have the capacity to love another person and empathize with another person and feel compassion for another person and be vulnerable with another person and have received that compassion from another person, that love from another person, that person is severely crippled. And arguably, it's a lie that you love yourself first. It's actually a lie. It's actually not true. Children are loved by their parents. And then they learn how to see themselves properly. You start out by identifying with your mother. And then you gradually learn to conceive of yourself as separate. When you're young, 2, 3, you think your mother's in your head and she can see everything you can see. You eventually realize you can deceive her between 3 and 4 years old. There's an experiment they do to check whether your kids figured that one out yet. The separation anxiety, the attachment figure, and then you gradually, through that love with another person, are then able to conceive of yourself as an individual. Even if your parents messed up, you then have to go back and find a good book or a good therapist and go over the whole thing again to heal and learn to love yourself. And so even this ability to love yourself is cultivated in the loving embrace of another. You follow this? So we talk about, you got to love yourself first. What we really mean is at some point after you've been loved enough, you can figure that one out and then go back and have more meaningful relationships with other people. But developmentally, we love another first before we even know that we exist as an individual. Before we're even developed enough to conceive of ourselves as being distinct from our attachment figures. And we describe a narcissist or severely shut down emotionally or avoidant, personality, whatever. We have a whole bunch of language to describe such people. So the whole cluster C personality disorders get into this. Anyway, obviously narcissism is not that. So not only is it a less complete understanding, but it's also it's a tougher road to walk. And it's not like it's tougher, but it takes you further. No, it actually takes you less far and it's harder. Well, the benefit is just in the journey. Not necessarily. If the journey is more circuitous, it doesn't take you as far. It's it just becomes some sort of ego trip. It's not even like you actually care. And maybe you can come up with a couple one-liners to justify it, but it really becomes profoundly stupid. I'm going to take a worse route, fraught with danger, that actually gives me no value. There's no lessons I'm going to learn on that road. I learn all the lessons on that road. I learn those and more on this road. And this road's nicer and it's better for people. And it's more true, and it's more in congruence with reality. Now I'll take the slightly beguiled, slightly illusioned, imperfect conception that doesn't take me as far and sucks. Give me that one. I'll take that for $20. So we need to find a bigger yes. We need to find a reason to get up in the morning. We need to find a reason to be chaste. We need to find a reason to follow our very ascetic lifestyle. And the reason is because we really love Krishna. And we really want to be close to Krishna. We really want to see Krishna. We really want to get Krishna. We really want to pierce through the matrix and see the sweet Lord who's behind all of it. That's also part of us and we're part of him, but there's enough distinction for there to be an embrace and a dance. And this stuff affects everything. If you think that everything is one, then any devotion you feel, any compassion you feel, will always be accompanied by a remembrance that that's not ultimately truth. And that really, like, the goal is to be totally callous towards other people. And to be essentially a sociopath. Some sort of benign sociopath who has no capacity for deeply feeling for another person because you've transcended that. Alternatively, if you are a personalist, then you can meditate on your oneness with divinity and your spiritual position and realize that that's going to help you come closer to divinity, because if you want to approach the fire, you have to also become fire-like. And so you can do pranayama and meditate on your spirituality and meditate on your purity and meditate on your divinity, and at the same time embrace your sweet Lord. At the same time have room for love and compassion and so on and so forth. So it's like these basic conceptions of what is factor into the way you live your life and what your spiritual practice, what's the internal process that accompanies your spiritual practice. You could have an impersonalist doing kirtan, they're crying, but ultimately they think that there is no God, not connecting with God, and they are God. They just do this because it's a quicker way to, like, bhakti is a better way to get to that place, a trance. Whenever somebody tells me I meditate, I'm like, oh, what do you meditate on? Like, oh, I just kind of breathe. I'm like, oh, you breathe, okay. Try and think of nothing. Okay, so you breathe and think of nothing. Because that's not how I meditate. I envision the deity and myself and our relationship. And so the answer to these questions really tells you and everybody else, whoever you talk to about it, what you're thinking of while you're doing your spiritual practice, what your internal life is like, what your consciousness is like when you're engaged in the movements and the rituals and the externals. It tells you what the substance is behind the form. For instance, let's just think it through. Imagine if somebody was doing yoga. The only reason they were doing yoga was because they wanted to develop their butt, like their gluteus medius and maximus. There must be a minimus in there too. You follow? Like the Pilates wasn't enough, and squatting wasn't enough, and there was something about, yoga and something about its capacity to firm the buttocks. And so that's what they were into. And they were in that yoga class doing that because they were trying to attract, there was somebody else in the yoga class, and they were trying to make time with them. And so they were actually there just like for seduction. You follow? They show up at yoga, and their whole purpose there is to hook up, sexually. That's what they're trying to do. Then you got somebody else in that yoga class, right? And their whole purpose is they're in so much pain because of their individual existential situation that they just want to forget everything and forget that they exist, and they're running away from their existence. And they like going to yoga because the workout puts them in a trance-like state and they can just forget everything. They're doing the exact same pose as the first person. Then you got another person, and they're doing the exact same pose, and they love the divine and feel blessed that they have a body, want to keep their body in tip-top shape so they can do service, and they need to do some form of exercise, so they want to do a form of exercise which is connected to their spiritual tradition. And they meditate on Krishna, Krishna's leelas, Krishna's form, while doing pranayam, while doing their asanas. And they just feel immense gratitude towards the divine for the gift of the body, for the gift of the mind, for the gift of yoga. And they spend their time doing yoga, the exact same poses as the first two people, filled with this sort of romantic gratitude and ecstasy towards the divine. All three of those people are doing headstands and like squeezing their butt and like pointing their toes towards the air, up towards the ceiling. You follow? But they're thinking of those three things. One is a nihilist, the other one's a sensualist, and the other one's a devotee. Those three people are actually doing three different things, even though they're all doing the same asana. They're in three different universes. Their mental world, what they're thinking about, changes the entire landscape. And so these sort of abstract philosophical subjects that appear in some ways to be highly unrelated to what we're going through in our day-to-day, they couldn't be more connected. We've gotten out of the idea that you're put on this earth to enjoy. By now we're out of that idea. Now we're at the idea that you're put on this earth to cultivate a relationship with the divine. And now the question is, what is the nature of that divine, and therefore what is the nature of a relationship? Sorry I went over time. Thanks so much for joining me. IGTV. Adios. Hasta mañana.